Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I'm so delighted you've joined me tonight. I do hope that you're exceedingly well, sending you loads and loads of love, and don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee, whatever it is you drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Casey and I'm from the northwestern states in the United States known as Idaho, which is well known for its mountainous landscape and vast swathes of wilderness and outdoor areas for recreational activities like hiking, mountain biking and horse riding. Our capital, Boise, is situated at the foothill of the Rocky Mountains and is intersected by the Boise River, well known for rafting and fishing. I live in southwestern Idaho in a lush park-like property with ubiquitous trees that make up a vast sylvan towards the rear of my land. I live along the Payette River that drains into the Snake River to give you an idea of bearings. Our house is the quintessential beautiful wooden log home, built in a more modern contemporary style, but inspired by early, former historic, rather nostalgic, wistful log homes from our past that stir up evocative, sentimental memories of bygone days, with hunters returning home from the hunt, with hungry stomachs being greeted by their adoring kids and welcomed home by a devoted wife offering him a huge hearty bowl of beef stew, which he eats by a crackling fire with his whole family. I'm very partial towards our sumptuous cosy abode because it's so large and spacious with large open fireplaces and seamless large glass windows overlooking exquisite lakefront views that still have the ability to take my breath away, despite the fact that I've lived in this spectacular part of the world for many years with my wife Pamela and our two young boys, Curtis and Jonathan, who were about 10 years old at the time of my story, which occurred in the spring of 2005. My incredulous story begins when I decided to buy two beautiful dogs, as my children had been begging me to get them a furry friend. But I'm a huge procrastinator that tends to take my time pondering and ruminating over every single decision I make. I was desirous to get the very best dog to suit our family needs and was thinking about purchasing two Bernese mountain dogs, but I kept wavering over my decision. Was it the right breed for our family, I wondered. I could not be sure. My mother, who lived in Dallas, informed me that I was far better off getting a couple of Beacon Fries, and when I wrote down bacon fries. Oh, they're the most adorable dogs, she told me. You really don't want to get something big and rambunctious that could potentially knock the children over. I think smaller dogs are so much better, and this is a very good breed for you. Of course, the two women in my life did not agree. My wife believed emphatically that for a sizable property like ours, we needed larger dogs, and she gets very frustrated by me when I become indecisive. For goodness sake, Casey, she snapped, stop dilly-dallying and buy those two dogs for the family. But, I protested, no buts, Casey. I'm tired of those buts of yours. Just get those dogs now, she ordered. And that was that. You may think my wife is a bully, but that is certainly not the case, as she's actually rather a saint, putting up with my ambiguous temperament. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course, I am the kind of husband that would drive most women nuts because I'm so ambivalent and can never make my mind up about anything. I've been informed that this is because I'm a Libran star sign, and even I get frustrated with my own unassertive and irresolute approaches to life. I'm glad that my job in the paper industry does not require any decision-making, or I rarely would be in hot water. And so it was, after my wife's prompting, I returned home with two adorable balls of fluff that originate from the Swiss Alps and have roots with Roman Mastiffs. They're supposed to be intelligent, loyal, and very affectionate, which I was to discover is indeed the case. When the dogs were old enough, I built them a very sizable outside wooden house, far bigger than a natural kennel. It was the size of a standard bedroom, both in height and width. And I put an old couch in there, a large bed, dog beds, and even toys for them to play with, so they really had their own little doggy oasis, so to speak, that protected them from the outside elements. I wanted them to have their own indoor space, where no one would mind if they tore the beds to shreds, if you know what I mean. Before long, our family became very attached and devoted to the two long-haired dogs that we named Pegasus and Gypsy, and my children adored the black and white tan bundles of fur that they played with every day, throwing around balls and frisbees and fondling their lovely long coats. It was not long before I began to notice some strange irregularities in regards to the outside doghouse. One thing I observed was that when I went into the doghouse in the early mornings to fill up the water bowls and to feed my dogs, I would detect a very strange odour in the room. Don't get me wrong, it was by no means offensive. It was just very different, and I knew the pungent smell did not come from my dogs. The only way I could describe the smell, that it rather reminded me of fermented apples, not to put too fine a point on it. I noticed the smell was strongest on the large bed in the corner of the room. That was decidedly odd. It gave me the very distinct impression that something or someone had been lying on that bed for quite a considerable period of time in order for the scent to be that pronounced. Then if that wasn't strange enough, the bowls of dog biscuits I'd given my dogs remained untouched, day in and day out. As you can imagine, I became increasingly concerned for the health of my animals, as I couldn't fathom why they were not eating their food, but to look at, they were bouncy balls of ubiquitous energy, which didn't make any sense at all, considering they didn't appear to be eating. After a solicitous visit to the vet, I was assured and consolidated by the checkup that both my dogs were indeed fighting fit and putting on plenty of healthy weight required for growing puppies. The vet went as far as to say that both my dogs were in pristine, excellent condition, and even asked what my secret was and what I was actually feeding them, because of their glossy coats. He described them as among the healthiest dogs he'd ever met. I remember feeling exceedingly perturbed and bemused, as my dogs were eating absolutely nothing. Well, that's what I thought at the time. I was later to discover leg bones of deer and other animals lying strewn over the floor, and I began to realise that someone else was feeding my dogs behind my back. And if they were getting fresh meat delivered to them daily, it was hardly a wonder they weren't interested in their measly dog biscuits, and who could blame them for that? I mean, if I was a dog, I'd sooner have a fillet steak any day than a bland biscuit diet, wouldn't you? Other strange things happened at night, as during the night I'd hear whistling and the sound of our dogs making those happy, jubilant barks, so indicative of the sounds they made when they were pleased to see us after we returned home from a shopping stint. This was when I began to suspect that our dogs were being visited by a stranger, and I remember feeling rather angry about this, because these dogs were ours, for goodness sake. What right did a transient have to interact with our animals, not to mention bringing them choice meat all the time? It just wasn't right, and that was outright bribery, because if the dogs kept receiving 5-star treatment like this from the mysterious interloper, it would naturally predispose them to liking this impostor more than any of us, which didn't bode well with me. My wife kept telling me to get a grip, and that our visitor, whoever they were, was probably a young lonely boy who just happened to love animals. I mean, what was the harm in that, she told me. I've no idea where my wife got this peculiar idea in her head from, but she was so insistent that we did not interfere with the strange anomalies around our home, and told me over and over again, in no uncertain terms, to stop overreacting. One night I heard a shrill whistling sound very clearly, as it was very high-pitched. I sat up very suddenly in my bed, aroused from my deep sleep, wondering whether I had dreamt the sound. But then I heard it again, and I was certain of it. I stumbled out of bed cloddishly and made my way towards the bedroom window, which was on the second floor of our home. It was a particularly dark night, and glancing down towards our verdant lawn, all I could see was the large silhouette of this man, who looked to be about 8 foot tall and 3 foot wide. I mean, how was that even possible? I mean, even the tallest humans aren't that big. So I was flummoxed and confused. That really is an understatement when I say that. It was difficult to discern this individual closely because it was too dark outside, with not enough sufficient moonlight to pronounce his features clearly. It was what my dogs were doing that really was discomposing for me. They were acting as if this stranger was indeed their very best friend, licking him all over his face and wagging their tails profusely. I noted that even my dogs are not that affectionate towards me, which left me feeling really rather annoyed and aggrieved at this stranger, who was playing with them and ruffling up their coats affectionately, and they were loving every minute of it. For me, he appeared very hazy and blurred, like the vague pictures of a television set on the blink, because the night was not kind to my field of vision. I began to shake my wife vigorously to try and arouse her, and at the best of times she's not very amenable to be awoken during the middle of the night, as she's always disagreeable and grumpy if you try and rouse her from a deep sleep. But on this occasion I was determined to get her undivided attention, but I need not have even bothered, given her nonchalant, disinterested response. "Get up," I said. "Get up quickly. I want to show you something. Get up now." "What's it now, Casey?" grumbled my wife, sounding annoyed. "Can't you get to sleep?" "The man, he's out there, playing with our dogs." "Oh, please, Casey," moaned my wife. "Leave the poor boy alone and let him play with our dogs if he wants to. What's the harm in that? He means them no harm." "But," I stammered, "the boy is 8 feet tall." "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Casey," moaned my wife. "Get back to sleep. Your imagination is playing tricks with you. Go back to bed, for goodness sake, and stop being so ridiculous." I must admit I stood there feeling exceedingly frustrated, especially with my wife, because no one was taking me seriously at all. But I knew I didn't want someone messing around with my dogs, and so I ventured outside armed with my rifle. That was when I heard the sound of someone bolting out of the doghouse as fast as they could. I knew that the fellow had heard me, based on the startled noise he made, that rather reminded me of paint cans being tossed around violently. I was to find out later that he'd actually knocked over the dog bowls in his hurry to escape. It was that raucous, banging and crashing, very loud sound, as quite honestly the dude sounded like a rhino charging through the thicket as he ran away. I was able to observe his ghostly shadow gliding away as fast as he could, glancing nervously back in my direction. What alarmed me the most was that this evasive person moved like the wind, taking 5-foot strides into the sylvan, and then he was gone. It would seem that not only was he the fastest man that I've ever observed in my life, but the tallest too. I went back into the doghouse to see 2 very exuberant dogs that were very excited to see me, if not rather surprised and bewildered, given how late it was. I noted the room smelt very pungent with apple cider, and now I was certain the stranger was also a drunkard, who rather enjoyed a little too much cider, and clearly loved dogs. It wasn't a good mix as far as I was concerned. I could see my dogs were still enjoying some meaty bones that they'd been given, and their dog biscuits had barely been touched, but given the thick layers of meat dangling off the bone, I did understand their preferences. The next morning I happened to notice some distinct footprints outside the doghouse that left me completely speechless. It transpired that for an entire week our whole area had been hit with turbulent weather, with constant thunderstorms and incessant unrelenting rain, relegating our entire family to indoor activities like card games and chess, as conditions outdoors were less than favourable, and the yard had literally become like a mud bath, and the turf exceedingly wet. Imagine my total amazement when I observed a gigantic footprint in the ground. I measured it with my tape measure, and it was over 20 inches long. I mean, who in the world has feet that large? Even when I placed my foot in the print, it was seemingly swallowed up by the sheer size of this thing, and I don't exactly have small feet. I immediately called my wife to come outside, and I could see her rolling her eyes in the back of her head as she came out into the backyard to humour me, waggling her wooden spoon in her hands, as she was in the middle of making a cheese sauce for the mac and cheese we were having later that evening. "What's it now, Casey?" she groaned. "This better be good," she exclaimed. "I do not appreciate being dragged out in the middle of my cooking. The last thing I need is my cheese sauce to get lumpy." "Look," I exclaimed. "That 8-foot man that I keep telling you about, that is surreptitiously visiting our dogs and sneaking them food. Look at his footprint. It's 20 inches long. That's insane. It's not normal. It practically swallows my own shoe size. And my feet are pretty big, let me tell you." "Oh, for goodness sake, Casey, have you really got nothing better to do with your time than obsess about people's shoe sizes? But look at the size of this thing, sweetheart. It's massive. I measured it. It's 20 inches. "Casey, some people do actually have big feet," said my wife, barely even glancing at the footprints. I once had a girlfriend at school who had shoes especially made for her because her feet were so enormous. I think she was a size 11 or 12. It does happen, dear. I could see her shaking her head as she returned to the kitchen. I could tell she was not taking anything seriously at all and was thinking I was just a silly man with a bee in my bonnet about something. For many weeks this erroneous behaviour with the tall man seemed to continue, and of course no one in my family paid any attention to the strange goings-on, nor did they care about my grave concerns regarding this curious matter. Even my children were indifferent, and they became accustomed to the peculiar smells of apple cider in the dog-room, including all the bones, and none of them batted an eyelid. I also realised with horror that I was actually the butt of everybody's jokes, as I once eavesdropped in on my wife's conversation with her girlfriends and heard her telling them over tea in our living room that I claimed that a giant 8-foot drunk with huge feet was visiting our dogs in the middle of the night with fresh meat deliveries. For some reason everybody found that highly amusing, and I'm sure people thought I was smoking something, but I knew what I'd seen. I remember her friends giving me these fleeting, pitiful looks, as if in some way I wasn't quite right in the head. One day we discovered to our horror that Gypsy had disappeared and had seemingly vanished into thin air. We sent out leaflets, put posters up on trees in our area, and contacted local shelters to spread the word that Gypsy was missing. But no one had seen either sight or sound of her. My children were naturally very upset, and Pegasus became lonely because he was all on his own without a friend. So my wife immediately went and brought another Burmese mountain dog behind my back, possibly because she knew I would take forever to decide whether such a move was a good idea or not. We chose to call the male dog Captain, and he became a welcomed, very treasured addition to our family, with a very congenial temperament, I might add. I felt very disgruntled with my wife as I told her that the 8-foot man had stolen Gypsy. This was confirmed to me when the doghouse no longer smelt of apple cider, and there were no fresh meat deliveries for Pegasus, and he had reluctantly begun to eat his doggy biscuits, which had to be a good thing, surely. One day I decided to go and explore the sylvan at the back of my property that stretched back for many miles and was a substantial habitat for indigenous wildlife. It was an area that I never visited much because it was very overgrown, but on this occasion I decided to investigate it, as I knew that the strange man that had visited our property had run deep into the sylvan. Could it be that he hung around there, and was it possible that he had abducted Gypsy? For me, the idea seemed very plausible. As I walked through the shaded, enchanting treed oasis that consisted of ponderosa pines, red cedar, Douglas firs and hemlocks, I was amazed to find so many wide trails in this wooded area, as this sylvan was not maintained by anyone, but someone had been keeping the trails quite open, which was more than a little baffling, but very pleasing, of course. I'd like to point out that I had never discerned this before. In the past, the thicket had been quite overgrown, but not now. I noticed that there were periwinkles and violets and ferns that carpeted the forest floor so prettily, and the morning sun filtered through the trees, dappling this wooded retreat in resplendent light, rather like an artist's palette, providing different tonal shades to all the scenery. I also observed rocky ridges and steep elevated mountain trails, and of course an enchanting silvery stream that meandered through the valley. I remember thinking to myself how magical this place was because it was incredibly beguiling, and the forest was alive with pretty bird song and warbles, and I noted little rabbits hopping around the woodland area, and I could also detect copious amounts of deer scat. Suddenly I could see my beautiful dog Gypsy running towards me as if we'd never been apart. She covered my face with wet licks and thumped her tail happily on the ground. I could feel the tears of joy welling up in my eyes. "Gypsy, where did you get to? Where have you been? We've been looking for you everywhere, my girl. We've missed you so much." I cradled her joyfully in my arms, and I could see that she was in excellent, vibrant health, and seemed incredibly happy, and was also very delighted to see me. All of a sudden I could discern something or someone watching me from the tree line, and it caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up on end. I looked up towards the vertical line of the ponderosa pines, and there he was, and he was not even attempting to hide his presence from me, for indeed I think he wanted me to behold him. I was so shocked by what I was observing with my eyes that I was rather too overwhelmed and nonplussed to actually be afraid, although in hindsight I most certainly should have been, given the imposing colossal size of the critter. I knew at once that I was scrutinising the mysterious 8-foot elusive stranger whom had been paying regular visits to my doghouse. But this was no man. What was he? I couldn't even begin to imagine, for I'd never heard of such an outlandish critter existing in North America. For this encounter was so incredulous and bizarre, it literally shifted my perception of reality, rather like a bolt of lightning, making me re-examine everything I knew about the natural world. This humanoid critter was remarkably human in his countenance, but there were very evident ape-like influences to his appearance, most especially noted in the long flowing chocolate brown hair that covered his entire body, with the exception of his broad heart-shaped face that was hairless, and was a deep nut brown colour, rather like a Caucasian man whose browned considerably from extensive sun exposure. I noted that the overlong arms hung well beyond his knees, and he possessed a very distinctive pyramid-shaped head with a point at the top, and this head flowed into the shoulders seamlessly, and there was no evidence of a neck. I also could not comprehend the astounding size of this critter, as in close proximity I noted how colossal he actually was, and I think he would have impressed the bodybuilding community, as his muscle strength and definition were off the charts. I think he was easily about 800 pounds, but I cannot be too sure on these details. What I do know, however, is that the humanness to this critter was quite profound. I would not describe myself as an accomplished hunter by any manner of means, but I think I would have found it a challenge to take a pop shop at one of these beings, because they have an uncanny humanness which would cause me to wrestle with my conscience over such a manoeuvre. The critter stood there regarding me with his deep-set dark eyes, but he didn't appear hostile or even remotely aggressive. It was like he was observing me in a mellow, carefree fashion from a distance, with a keen, inquisitive interest and intrigue. This was not very consoling for me, however, because I was so intimidated by this beast, as I discerned I was in the presence of an apex predator, as indeed, if this critter wanted to kill me, he could have done so in a heartbeat, with the efficiency and skill of a human twisting a chicken's neck. It would have been that easy for him. I noted that my gypsy was looking towards the critter with such an adoring expression on his face and wagging his tail profusely, and he dashed towards the critter, barking happily and then returning back to me. "Come, girl," I said, grabbing her by the collar. "Come." Gypsy froze to the spot, resisting my determined efforts to take her back home. I tried to drag her, but she would not budge or move a muscle. She refused to go with me. I realised with absolute horror that Gypsy did not want to come home with me. Now that was very hard for me to accept. How was that even possible, as she was our family dog? To my amazement, the critter whistled and Gypsy ran eagerly towards him. I watched in absolute awe and disbelief as Gypsy embraced this hairy critter with an obedient devotion, like they were just so incredibly bonded. I've never seen anything like this before, as I could see how attached they were to each other, and it was quite moving to see the tenderness between the two of them, yet disconcerting at the same time. It was not easy for me to accept, as you can imagine. I watched in stupefied awe and in stunned silence as the two of them glided into the forest together. Gypsy had made her decision. She had chosen to live with this strange humanoid critter over me, and that was hard to fathom, as it made no sense to me at all, and was very discomposing. Of course, when I returned home to tell my wife what I'd seen, she asked me if I was feeling well. "Sweetheart," she said, "you must be coming down with something. You look rather peaky." "Did you hear what I said? Gypsy's in the wood living with the 8-foot hairy monster that I told you about." "I heard you, dear," said my wife. "I know you miss Gypsy terribly much. We all do. But we need to move on now, so stop feeding your imagination with these crazy, nonsensical ideas. It's not healthy for you. And even if what you say is true, and the boy did take Gypsy and wants her to stay with him, well, she's made her choice. She's chosen him over us." "But it's a big, hairy, ape-like monster that's taken her," I told my wife, knowing at once that I must sound so silly. No wonder she thought I was off my head. Imagine my amazement when a little while later my wife had actually called the doctor around to her house. "Oh, thank you, Dr. Murray, for coming. I'm rather worried about Casey. Ever since our dog Gypsy went missing, he's been a little out of sorts. He's been talking all kinds of nonsensical stuff about 8-foot monsters living in the Sylvan, kidnapping her. I think he's having hallucinations. He is predisposed to having a very overactive imagination at the best of times." "Oh, I see," said the doctor. "Now that is interesting. He's obviously traumatized by losing his dog. He may respond well to some counselling sessions, as he's not alone in his distress in losing an animal. It happens very, very often. It's a common phenomenon now, as people become very attached to their pets." "That's not a bad idea," said my wife, "but have you got anything to calm him down immediately?" So after being given a bunch of tranquilizers to calm my nerves, and advised by the doctor to procure some counselling sessions, I came to the realisation that I needed to let sleeping dogs lie. One day, imagine my amazement when we discovered 6 healthy-looking baby puppies on our doorstep in an apple container, and they were the cutest puppies that I've ever seen. I remember my exuberant kids came running into the house telling me they'd found some baby mountain dogs on the step in the box, and our family fell in love with all these quintessential bundles of joy. And of course my kids wanted to keep them all, but let me assure you that was never going to happen. I realised at once the origins of these mysterious puppies. They were from the 8-foot hairy man in the woods, and that they were clearly Gypsy's puppies. But imagine my amazement when blood tests confirmed that they were pedigree Burmese mountain dogs. Then it hit me like a brick to the head that Gypsy had never been spayed, nor had Captain had the snip. As a family, we'd been extremely lackadaisical in getting them neutered and spayed, so I realised that Captain was indeed the father and Gypsy the mother of those gorgeous little puppies. I imagine Captain had run off into the Sylvan when he smelt that Gypsy was on heat. I believe the strange hairy creature brought us the puppies so that we could find them loving homes, which is what we invariably did, although we did keep one of the puppies that we chose to call Biscuit. After a while we did get regular visits from Gypsy, as I think the hairy man felt sorry for us, so he brought her over to our home to interact not only with our animals, but with our children as well, and of course with her puppies. And these visits continued over many years. I took these golden opportunities to get a friend of mine who was a vet to give Gypsy her annual shots and inoculations. She would stay with us for a few hours and then return to her home in the Sylvan when she heard the hairy man whistling for her to go back. I realised Gypsy lived up to her name, as she was a gypsy in a manner of speaking. It was only about a couple of years later that my wife actually had a sighting of the critter, and she was very excited and told me, "Casey, you'll never believe what I saw. It was about 8 foot and covered with long hair." I remember saying to her, "Really? It sounds like your imagination is playing tricks with you, dear." All these years later, I realised that the critter in the woods fits the profile perfectly of a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, I loved that story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.